While the world's attention is focused on the war in Iran, the Trump administration has kept up its pressure campaign on Cuba in a bid to install leadership more aligned with U.S. interests. For nearly 3 months, the U.S. has imposed an oil blockade on the island, exacerbating its long running energy crisis and leading to dire humanitarian consequences. I'm Adam Gallagher, a contributing fellow at Defense Priorities, and today I'll be speaking with Defense Priorities fellow Dan DePetris. Dan and I are going to talk about U.S. Cuba relations today, why a Venezuela style approach to Cuba is unlikely to work, and what a better policy would look like. Here are 3 things you need to know. Hey, Dan. Thanks for joining me today. Wondering if you could just start us off by talking about the current state of play of the U.S. pressure campaign on Cuba and how these discreet talks between Secretary of State Rubio and Castro's grandson are going.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Adam. The Trump administration has spent the last several months enacting a very, very significant pressure campaign over the island, and they've done this mainly through economic coercion. So they've essentially decided to place a de facto oil embargo over the island to make it more difficult for third parties, whether it be Mexico or Venezuela, to send fuel oil to the country. The administration has also cracked down very, very hard on what they call Cuba's doctors program. So Cuba basically, it exports a lot of their healthcare professionals around the world. I think it's something about 40 or 50,000 Cuban doctors are operating in third parties, third countries. And that has basically sent a lot of revenue to the Cuban state. I think the last estimate I saw was about $4 billion a year, which is not insignificant for a country like Cuba. So the administration has essentially cracked down on all these programs to starve the communist government in Cuba to come to the table with the United States in a weakened position. And those talks are ongoing right now. We know very little because the negotiations had been pretty discreet thus far. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is supposedly taking the lead on that, and Raul Castro, who of course is the 95-year-old, well, I'll call him the supreme leader of Cuba, who still makes many of the decisions. Castro's grandson, Raul Guillermo Rodriguez Castro, is supposedly leading the Cuban delegation. So we'll see where those talks go. They're currently in process.
Okay. Yeah, I was just reading something yesterday and talking to a woman I know who's a professor at the University of the West Indies about how the ripple effects of this and it's impacting Caribbean states' healthcare because, the Cubans are their medical system is so advanced and they send doctors around the region to help with different healthcare issues. So, yeah. So could you walk us through, sort of this piece that you wrote I think it was last week for MS Now, talking about how, a Venezuela-style approach to Cuba is unlikely to work, why the regime is a little bit more insulated than what we saw in Venezuela.
Yeah, sure. So, Adam, as essentially what the administration did in Venezuela was take out Nicolas Maduro, who was the president on top of the Venezuelan political system, and throw the dice at Maduro's deputy, Delcy Rodriguez, who is proving to be far more pragmatic and willing to cooperate with the United States on things like oil access, kicking out some of the Cuban intelligence operatives that were operating on Venezuelan soil for a very long time, for decades. And I think the administration is ultimately trying to replay that play in Cuba. And the point of that piece in MS Now is basically to show people that the Cuban regime does not operate and look like the Venezuelan regime did under Maduro. In Venezuela, you basically had competing factions within an overarching system in Venezuela. And Maduro was really, he likes to portray himself as sort of like the head honcho in there, but he was really a power broker, kind of, balancing the competing priorities inside the regime. With Cuba, you have a much more top down system that has been developed over a span of 6 decades. It's very hierarchical. And you have, even people outside the government, like the Castro family, many of whom don't have formal positions inside the government, but nevertheless have really, really high, strong political power for the country. So the political system between the two countries is not identical. I would argue it's not similar. It's not even a similar wavelength. So the administration's bid to kind of replay the Venezuela playbook inside Cuba would be ideal. Ideally would work, but realistically, I believe it's probably going to be tougher to execute, just because the regime is in Havana, knows how to survive. Um, they operate on a very similar playbook, and it's going to be very hard to pick different personalities apart and divide them from within. Uh, we'll see if the administration's bet works. I'm betting it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean the regime has certainly shown resiliency since 1959 against all sorts of U.S. economic and other kind of pressure. So why don't you tell us what a better policy toward Cuba would look like? And here I just want to point out that you sort of presciently, before all of this started with the Trump administration's pressure campaign on Cuba, you wrote an explainer for defense priorities addressing this very issue. So let us know what that would look like, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, I view the policy that Trump is enacting now as completely, unneeded and unnecessary. There's a large perception within the U.S. body politic ever since Fidel Castro rose to power in 1959 that the Cubans are a direct, dire security threat to the United States. They undermine U.S. foreign policy, not only inside the Western Hemisphere, but in places like Africa, the Middle East, parts of Asia. That was very prominent during the Cold War. And
Right.
in some ways, it's understandable. The Cubans, they're a small country. Cuba's a very small country, but it punched above its weight during the Cold War. You can make that argument. Today, though, that argument has really fallen by the wayside. The Cuban economy is just a dumpster fire right now, and that's probably putting it charitably. The Cuban military is a former shell of what it once was 30, 40 years ago. The notion that Cuba presents some sort of imminent threat to the United States no longer passes the laugh test. So essentially what I was trying to argue in that explainer was all the United States really needs to do is normalize relations with Cuba. And that's, I understand that's sort of an argument people have made repeatedly over the last 20 years. But for some reason, whether it's domestic U.S. politics, whether it's just a completely inaccurate perception of the threat Cuba poses to the United States and to the Western Hemisphere, that very simple policy has been repeatedly kind of undermined or pushed out the back door, with the exception, of course, of the Obama administration during the second term, where he did negotiate with the Cubans diplomatic normalization, allowing the Treasury Department to do things that they wouldn't normally do through sanctions exemptions and temporary waivers on certain banking activity and things like that. So the embargo was still on the books, but it was being enforced at a level that not at its peak. So besides that, U.S. Cuba policy essentially looked the same over the last 40, 50, 60 years. I mean, you could draw a straight line between the policy in 2026 to what it was during 1961 when the trade embargo was first enacted.
Yeah, right.
So basically, we can normalize with them. We don't have to worry about Cuba as some sort of security threat. And we could try to chip away at the animosity that has kind of grown between these two countries over a span of 6 decades.
Yeah. I wonder if I could just ask you one quick bonus question here. Given how badly things are going with the war in Iran, I'm curious how you think that could affect the administration's calculations when it comes to Cuba. I mean, do you think that could maybe push them to go for something that might be seen as an easier win, or make them a little bit more reticent to engage in what could be a risky regime change sort of endeavor?
It's difficult to say. I mean, at first glance, I don't think Trump is necessarily interested in regime change inside Cuba per se. I think he's interested in taking out some of the top figures in the Cuban regime, whether it's arresting them or driving them from power through some sort of diplomatic agreement, and putting in place, figures that are more palpable to his demands, which is basically the Venezuela-style. I guess you can call it regime change, but changing the regime from within through the Venezuela scenario, as opposed to what we're seeing unfold in Iran right now, which is essentially a comprehensive military campaign meant to degrade the regime militarily. I highly doubt we're going to see that scenario play out in Cuba. It seems like the Trump administration is more interested in using economic coercion over military force. Uh, but yeah, I mean, it's I don't take any options off the table with this president. I mean, he seems to be saying one thing on one day, says another thing on another day. Policy could change very, very quickly.
Indeed.
So I don't rule it out, but I just don't believe it's a high likelihood of a scenario.
Sure. All right. Well, thanks a lot for joining us, Dan. I just want to encourage everybody to head over to defensepriorities.org and check out your explainer and all the work you've been doing in Cuba and all the work that Defense Priorities has been doing in recent weeks on the war in Iran.